Greetings. We are going to analyze the crimes question from the February 2007 California Bar Exam. This question. It was question number 3. First, let me read the question. Dan has been in and out of mental institutions most of his life. While working in a grocery store stocking shelves, he got into an argument with Vic, a customer, who complained that Dan was blocking the aisle. When Dan swore at Vic and threatened to kick him out of the store, Vic told Dan he was crazy and should be locked up. Dan exploded in anger, shouted he would kill Vic, and struck Vic with his fist, knocking Vic down. As Vic fell, he hit his head on the tile floor, suffered a skull fracture, and died. Dan was charged with murder. He pleaded not guilty, and not guilty by reason of insanity. At the ensuing jury trial, Dan took the stand and testified that he had been provoked to violence by Vic's crude remarks and could not stop himself from striking Vic. Several witnesses, including a psychiatrist, testified about Dan's history of mental illness and his continued erratic behavior despite treatment. Now you're asked 4 things. Number 1, can the jury properly find Dan guilty of first-degree murder? Number 2, can the jury properly find Dan guilty of second-degree murder? Number 3, can the jury properly find Dan guilty of voluntary manslaughter? And number 4, can the jury properly find Dan not guilty by reason of insanity? To answer those questions, we should begin by doing a quick review of the law of homicide, because this is obviously what is being tested here. Now, the law of homicide begins with common law murder, or the best place to begin with it is with common law murder. Common law murder is defined here as homicide with malice, without excuse or justification or mitigation. That's the definition of common law murder. Please notice that the homicide in common law murder definition is the actus reus of the crime. Malice is the state of mind required, that's the mens rea of the crime. And excuse, justification, and mitigation are defenses. Excuse is a total defense. Justification is a total defense. And mitigation is a partial defense. It will reduce what would have been common law murder down to the voluntary manslaughter. Now, once you have common law murder, and this is our beginning point, please notice that voluntary manslaughter is something a little less than common law murder. So you have common law murder, voluntary manslaughter is kind of something a little less than that. But more than common law murder, we have 2 things which are more, sort of on the same structure. What happened is that common law murder, as you know, was a capital offense. Everybody guilty of it just kind of got hung, and that was the end of it. But as we became more civilized, we decided, gee, this isn't quite right. In fact, part of the reason that manslaughter was invented was to stop executing everybody who killed somebody. So manslaughter is a little bit lesser offense, but then you still have homicide as sort of almost one shoe fits all, and everybody gets executed. And so as we became more civilized, we said, no, we're not going to do it that way. that if someone has committed common law murder, we're going to look more closely at the circumstances, and only the people who have committed the most heinous types of common law murder are we going to execute, and the others is just going to be common law murder. And so we picked, if you're going to pick out the people who committed common law murder but with a worse state of mind somehow, or worse circumstances, more aggravating circumstances, if you pick out those people who committed common law murder under some bad circumstances, we call those people, they committed first-degree murder. So first-degree murder is simply common law murder, but committed with some aggravating circumstances. Not special circumstances, that's another term of art. Secondly, if the person committed common law murder, and you cannot establish the aggravating circumstances such as premeditation, killing of a police officer, that sort of thing. You cannot establish the aggravating circumstances, but you do have the common law murder, then what you have is second-degree murder. So what we did is to common law murder and say if it's got these special aggravating circumstances, it's first degree. If it doesn't happen, it's second degree. So second-degree murder really is just the same thing as just common law murder that you couldn't raise up to first degree. Now, now one more classification. Once you know that a person has committed first-degree murder, if you get that far, then we finally decided, rather than execute all the people who committed first-degree murder, some people who committed first-degree murder are, worse than others. And so we take first-degree murder and break it into a smaller class and say people who committed first-degree murder with special circumstances, and that's a term of art, special circumstances, with special circumstances, we're only going to execute those people. Otherwise, if you committed first-degree murder and you didn't have the special circumstances, then it's just first-degree murder. It's not capital murder. Okay, capital murder is first-degree murder with the special circumstances. Now, so what we have then is the basic structure is we have common law murder, we have something a little less than common law murder, namely voluntary manslaughter, and we have something a little more. We also have involuntary manslaughter, but we weren't asked about it in this question. So you have common law murder, you have something less than common law murder, voluntary manslaughter, and you have two things more than common law murder. You have first-degree murder, and within the first-degree murder, you have capital murder. So we need to understand these, and then they fall right. The analysis just kind of falls in place. Common law murder. It requires homicide with malice without any of the defenses. Okay, the defenses are excuse, justification, mitigation. So let's go back over here and take a look at common law murder. Common law murder requires homicide. What is homicide? Homicide is the actus reus of the crime. It requires that you establish that the defendant was the actual and proximate cause of the death of the victim. The defendant needs to be the actual and proximate cause, both. Most of the time this distinction is not of any value. It doesn't get tested on crimes questions. On torts questions, we see a lot of actual versus proximate cause distinctions. But in crimes, it almost never happens on the exam. So the homicide means that it's simply A killed B, and A killed B if the defendant was the actual and proximate cause of the death of the victim. Malice. Malice is the mens rea, the state of mind required. There are 4 and only 4 states of mind that will satisfy the malice requirements for common law murder. Those 4 states of mind are right here, 1, 2, 3, 4. Intent to kill, intent to inflict great bodily harm, wanton conduct, this is the stuff we call depraved heart conduct, wanton, willful, reckless conduct, in utter disregard of a high likelihood of great bodily harm or death, any way you want to say that stuff. So here's your wanton conduct, and finally the felony murder rule. If someone is killed during and because of the commission of one of the inherently dangerous common law felonies, we apply the felony murder rule. when the felony murder rule works, you end up getting first-degree murder, and first-degree murder that's one of the ways to get to first-degree murder. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail then. We understand homicide, a common law murder, is homicide with malice. We understand the homicide, actual proximate cause. Actual cause means but for the defendant's conduct, the harm would not have occurred. So the actual cause is the but for or substantial factor test. The proximate cause is asking, has the defendant's liability been terminated because of some bizarre thing that happened along the way? In torts, we call them superseding causes. We're asking here, was there some superseding cause which terminated the defendant's liability? Or even if you don't have a separate superseding event, you can have such an improbable, bizarre, strange sequence of events that led to the injury that nobody would have foreseen that, and that might be enough to terminate a person's liability. Takes care of that. Malice. Intent to kill, we know what that is. Intent to inflict great bodily harm, we know what that is. Wanton, willful, reckless conduct and utter disregard of a high likelihood of great bodily harm or death, we know what that is. And felony murder applies only to the inherently dangerous common law felonies. We don't have to go into detail in today's problem regarding the felony murder rule because it doesn't test this aspect of criminal law. But you should know that there are 4 versions of the felony murder rule. And most bar questions, you need to know this and pick out and deal with all of them. The common law view of felony murder, the red line view of felony murder, California view, and the model penal code. So we have homicide with malice without excuse. The 3 defenses here: excuse, justification, or mitigation. Let's look at the excuse. There are only 2 excuses: insanity and infancy. Infancy we have never had to deal with on the bar. Insanity, there are 4 views of insanity, and the bar examiners expect you to be familiar with them. The 4 views of insanity are the McNaughton rule, the irresistible impulse rule, model penal code, and Durham. And we need to know the details of all 4 of these, and this is an important part of what was being tested on this exam, so we will talk about the details of all 4 of these in just a few minutes. So one defense then, getting back to our big structure, without excuse, justification, or mitigation, these are the only 2 excuses. Justification differs from excuse. Excuse is saying that the person is excused really because there's nothing you can do about it. Justification is saying the next time this situation comes up, your conduct was justified, do it again. Example, a 3-year-old child picks up a weapon in the house and pulls the trigger and kills somebody and doesn't even realize what they did. Well, that person, the crime is excused by infancy. There's just nothing you can do about it. Under justification, someone tries to kill you and you exercise your privilege of self-defense and kill them first, and your conduct is justified. And justification means that the next time somebody tries to kill you, you should defend yourself again, completely justified. Next time, do it again. Whereas we're not saying in the case of excuse, do it again. We're saying there's really nothing the public can do about it. Excuse is a total defense. Justification is a total defense. Mitigation. The crime can be mitigated from what would have been common law murder down to voluntary manslaughter. Can be mitigated from what would have been common law murder down to voluntary manslaughter. There are 3 bases for doing that. These were tested on today's exam. The imperfect privilege, This is the case where the person thought they had a real privilege. Somebody was lying in bed late at night, and the window came up open, and this person was frightened because someone had been killed down the street a few nights ago. The window is coming up, and this person is scared to death, and they reach over and get their Uzi off of the night table, and when the shadow comes in the window, they gun it down. Now, this person thought they were, let's say they thought they were about to get killed, but really it was just a family member who left their key and was coming in the window. Well, if you can make out all the facts, this person really thought they had a privilege of self-defense. Even the facts I gave you might not be enough to create the privilege, but you can create a situation where a reasonable person might very well think, I need to use deadly force to protect myself. And yet, when you get to court, the court might disagree and say, well, you know, it's a close call, but we don't think you needed to use deadly force in this situation. So your privilege was imperfect, and you end up with voluntary manslaughter that way. Secondly, diminished capacity. The diminished capacity is another way to get to voluntary manslaughter. And this is the case, first of all, it's only followed in a minority of jurisdictions that have the doctrine. Most jurisdictions don't have it. And the ones that do have the doctrine only apply it to homicide cases, nothing else. And the policy is that in a homicide case, if a person, their capacity was diminished to the point where they were unable to form the malice that's required for the crime, unable to form the intent to kill or whatever you're using for your malice. If the person was unable to do that, if their capacity is diminished to that extent, then this is another way to reduce down to voluntary manslaughter. Now, if they're much crazier than that, they may be insane. But this is a place in between insanity and sanity. Heat of passion is the third basis for reducing what would have been common law murder down to voluntary manslaughter. The heat of passion has two requirements. You need some provocative event that is sufficient to provoke a reasonable person to act, to lose control, act out of blind passion. So you need the provocative event. And this provocative event has to meet two standards, objective and subjective. The objective standard is saying that a reasonable person would have been provoked to this extent under these circumstances, and the subjective part of the standard is saying this person was personally, individually provoked to that extent. Would a reasonable person have been provoked that much, and was this person provoked that much? The no cooling time requirement for the heat of passion, no cooling time also has two requirements, an objective and a subjective part. The objective part is saying a reasonable person could not have cooled that fast. The subjective part is saying this particular person, in fact, did not cool off. So you need all four of these standards to make the heat of passion. And so these are the three ways that what otherwise would have been common law murder can be mitigated down to voluntary manslaughter. Now, with that brief review of the law of homicide, let's take a look at the question. You first ask, let's back up for 1 second, please. Sorry, I need to talk about first degree and second degree murder, and then let's go to the question. First degree murder. Okay, first degree murder is common law murder with aggravating circumstances. Now, this term aggravating circumstances is not a term of art. It's just a made-up term to try to describe all this stuff over here. Okay, but it's not a formal term of art. And I'm making that distinction because there's a similar term, special circumstances, that is a term of art. This one's not just descriptive. So first degree murder is common law murder, so you don't get here unless you first have common law murder. Then you look to see if you have aggravating circumstances. Here are the aggravating circumstances commonly recognized in most states. Of course, each state has its own list, but this is the most commonly recognized list. Premeditated, lying in wait, poison, bomb, torture, felony murder rule. Okay, that'll get you up to first degree, just like we talked about. If a child is killed during a sex act, child is kidnapped and then some sex act is performed, the kid dies, that'll get you up to first degree. And all three of these P's will get you up to first degree. Killing a police officer in the line of duty, killing a prison guard in the line of duty, killing a politician in order to prevent that politician from carrying out his or her political agenda. Killing a politician to keep that person from carrying out his or her political agenda. So these are aggravating factors that are commonly used among a lot of states, and you can use this list for bar purposes. And first degree murder then is common law murder with one of these. Second degree murder, as we mentioned, is all common law murder that is not first degree. If you got common law murder and you can't raise it up to first degree, it'll end up as second degree murder. So that's how we get common law murder, that's how we get first degree murder, that's how we get second degree murder. And now I want to involuntary manslaughter. Pardon me. After we got to first degree murder, after first degree murder, I said to you that first degree murder is further broken into in that some first degree murders are worse than others. And it's only the real bad ones that you want to execute for people for. And that's what capital murder is about. Capital murder is first degree murder with special circumstances. And each state has its own list of special circumstances. Here's a typical list: multiple first degree murders, murder for economic gain. Now when we talk about murder for economic gain here, we're not talking about killing the cashier to get the money out of the cash register. We're talking about sort of white-collar economic gain, killing the insured to get the insurance money, killing a person, if you know you're the beneficiary of a will, kill the testator to get the money out of the will sooner, killing your law partner to take over the law firm, that sort of stuff. So murder for economic gain, murder for hire, this is the hirer and the hiree. All three of the P's that we had above, killing prison guards, police officers, politicians in the line of duty. Now, some people have trouble with the fact that the P's here can be used more than once. There's nothing wrong with using a fact more than once in legal analysis. And if the fact is that it was a child who was killed during a sex act, you can use that to raise the common law murder up to first degree, and you can use it again to raise the first degree to capital. So you can use the same fact more than once, perfectly okay. And so this is a list of typical special circumstances. So far we understand how to get common law murder, homicide with malice without excuse, justification, and mitigation. We understand that if you get common law murder, you can elevate it to first degree by looking for aggravating circumstances. If you have first degree, you might be able to elevate it still further to capital murder if you got the special circumstances, and you look to see if you have them. Now the one area that we still haven't talked about is involuntary manslaughter. We talked about voluntary manslaughter. Voluntary manslaughter is where you've got homicide, you've got the malice. Okay, for voluntary manslaughter, voluntary means what voluntary says. You kill somebody on purpose. So you got the malice. You get the homicide, killing somebody with malice, but you've got a mitigating factor, and that reduces it down to voluntary manslaughter. Now, in the case of involuntary manslaughter, this is the case where you really did not intend to kill anybody. And people die anyway. Vehicular manslaughters, involuntary manslaughter. Criminal negligence, didn't intend to kill anybody. Misdemeanor manslaughter rule, somebody was killed inadvertently while committing one of the malum in se misdemeanors. The misdemeanor manslaughter rule doesn't apply to all misdemeanors, just the malum in se misdemeanors and the non-dangerous felonies. So we understand then how to get to the various levels of criminal responsibility for the dead body. We start with common law murder. You may go down to voluntary manslaughter, or you may go up to first degree, and if you got first degree, you may go up again to capital. And then finally, if there was no intent to kill anybody, you may end up with involuntary, and somebody died anyway, you may end up with involuntary manslaughter. Now, in this problem, we are asked, can the jury properly find Dan guilty of first-degree murder? Well, we start with common law murder and say, can the jury find him guilty of common law murder? And if the jury can, so can the jury find Dan guilty of common law murder? Well, what did Dan do? Dan was a clerk in the store, had an argument with Vic, hit Vic, Vic fell, hit his head on the tile, Vic died. And so now Dan is charged with common law murder. Well, is charged with first-degree murder. We got to find common law murder first, and you understand from what I just told you why that's true. So can we find common law murder? Do we have homicide? Did Dan kill Vic? Well, yes. But for, remember you used the but for test right here. But for Dan hitting Vic, Vic wouldn't have died. So Dan is the actual cause. Proximate cause. There was nothing bizarre intervening, that nothing so strange happened that we should terminate Dan's liability. So nothing ended Dan's liability. So Dan's conduct is the actual and proximate cause of Vic's death. That's what you should actually write. Malice. What would you actually write here? Here you would actually write homicide. That homicide is the killing of one person by another. This means that the defendant's conduct was the actual and proximate cause of the death of the victim. Here, new paragraph, here according to the facts, Dan hit Vic, Vic fell and hit his head. Dan is the actual cause of Vic's death because but for hitting Dan wouldn't have died. Vic wouldn't have died. Dan is also the proximate cause of Vic's death because there is nothing after Dan struck Vic, there are no events which would terminate Dan's liability. Therefore, Dan's conduct is the actual and proximate cause of Dan's death. Malice. Can we establish malice? Well, on the facts that we have, I don't think you can establish that Dan intended to kill Vic. And you need to discuss this thoroughly. If you just give your personal opinion, that won't get you the points. But clearly, you know what happened. Vic got mad and hit him in the face, and he hit somebody with your fist. You can't convince the jury beyond a reasonable doubt that there was intent to kill when you just hit somebody with your fist. So you explain that fully. And you got to use the standard beyond a reasonable doubt to get the points out of this. Next, intent to inflict great bodily harm. Once again, give some argument here, but I think you would agree that you would have trouble convincing a jury that one person who simply hit another person, two men, one hits him in the face with his fist, that you got to convince a jury beyond a reasonable doubt that the hitter intended to inflict great bodily harm or death? No way. And there'd always be somebody who would have reasonable doubt as to whether or not you intended to inflict great bodily harm. But give a full explanation there. Next, wanton conduct. Do you think that Dan was acting wantonly in utter disregard of a high likelihood of great bodily harm or death? I don't think so. Again, you hit somebody with your fist, one man hits another man with his fist. Do you think it is highly likely that it will inflict great bodily harm or death? And this actor just acted in spite of knowing about this high likelihood of great bodily harm. Hitting somebody in the, with a fist just doesn't have that high likelihood of great bodily harm. So that's not going to work. But you have to give a full argument. Felony murder rule, there's no felonies involved here. This is not a robbery or something going on. So you really are going to have a lot of trouble establishing the malice. And if you can't establish the malice, you won't be able to establish the common law murder. And if you can't establish common law murder, of course, you're not going to get to anything above that. So that's the argument, really, regarding they ask you about first-degree murder, and the answer is, I don't think you can find first-degree murder because I don't think you can find common law murder because you're going to have a lot of trouble establishing the malice. Furthermore, you should continue the argument that even if you could find common law murder, and I don't think you can, but even if you could find common law murder, to find first-degree murder, which is what we are looking for, you've got to find common law murder plus one of these aggravating circumstances. Well, which aggravating circumstances can you pin on Dan? Dan wasn't lying in wait, poison, bomb, torture, felony murder, child, none of this stuff. Premeditation is the only possibility, and given the suddenness with which Dan was suddenly infuriated and did this, you could not convince a jury that beyond a reasonable doubt that Dan premeditated this. So the two reasons you cannot find first-degree murder are you can't find the malice, and even if you could, you cannot establish the aggravating circumstances. Okay. Second call to the question. Can the jury find Dan guilty of second-degree murder? Well, this one's easy now because we've already, second-degree murder is just common law murder that you cannot elevate, and so asking about second-degree murder is really just asking about what we've already done. So, no, Dan probably cannot, a jury probably could not convict Dan of second-degree murder because we could not establish the malice. And again, your argument, they ask you, the call to the question specifically says, can the jury properly find him? And so you need to point out that the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, and on these facts, would a jury find this is true beyond a reasonable doubt? And so far, Dan's winning. Now, so first-degree murder, no, because you can't get malice and you can't get the aggravating circumstances. Second-degree murder, no, because you can't get the malice. Voluntary manslaughter, well, let's take a look at that. First of all, you don't get to voluntary manslaughter unless you find malice, okay? No malice, no, you don't get that far if you can't find the malice. If you cannot establish malice, you go over to involuntary manslaughter, okay? Involuntary manslaughter is the homicide without the malice. Voluntary manslaughter is homicide with the malice, but with some mitigating circumstances. Notice, if you had homicide with malice, if you had the malice, we don't think you can find the malice. But if you had homicide with malice, if there was an excuse, be a total defense. They ask us about this excuse later on. Excuse, total defense. Justification, we didn't ask us about it, but that would be a total defense. Mitigation is a partial defense. It will reduce the crime down to voluntary manslaughter. Do we have any of these things that will reduce this crime to voluntary manslaughter? Do we have an imperfect privilege? No. Dan is not in a situation where he reasonably thought he had some privilege that he was exercising. Do we have diminished capacity? Well, I don't think so. The diminished capacity requires that Dan is unable to form the state of the malice, the intent to kill, unable to do it, not whether he did it or not, he's unable to do it. Now, Dan has a mental history, and what the bar examiners wanted you to do is to look at some of the details of his mental history. What do you have? You have witnesses who are testifying about his erratic behavior. You have a psychiatrist testifying about his erratic behavior. He's been in and out of mental institutions all of his life, and when you put all that together, is Dan a person who is unable to form these intents? We don't have any evidence of that. So I don't think you're going to use diminished capacity to get down to voluntary manslaughter. So far, you cannot use imperfect privilege to get down to voluntary manslaughter. You cannot use diminished capacity to get down to voluntary manslaughter, but you might be able to use heat of passion, because Dan did get very mad very quickly. Do we have a provocative event which would may cause a reasonable person to lose control, to act out of blind passion? Do you have such a provocative event? Well, the only event you have is Vic saying to Dan, "You're crazy and you should be locked up." Okay, no, that's not enough of a provocative event to cause a reasonable person to act out of blind passion like this. Now, please notice that that Dan is not your normal reasonable person. Dan is kind of crazy. We know that. He's been in and out of mental institutions all of his life. So Dan's kind of crazy, but when we say, would a reasonable person have gotten that angry over that event, we're not asking whether a reasonably crazy person. We're talking about a reasonable ordinary person. And a reasonable ordinary person would not have gotten that mad, and therefore I don't think we have the objective requirements. I don't think we have a provocative event that would have triggered someone to act out of blind passion. So you do not have the objective standards. You probably do have the subjective standards, but you need them both. So I don't think you're going to get heat of passion, but you make these arguments. The cooling time, obviously there was no cooling time. This all happened very quickly. So make your arguments. The conclusions are not important, but make them and make them thorough. This brings us then to the last part of the analysis of this problem, and that is, the last thing they ask us is, can a jury convict Dan of voluntary manslaughter? The answer is, to convict Dan of voluntary manslaughter, they'd have to find the malice, and we argue against it, but you just point out that this is what they'd have to do. They'd have to find the malice, and they'd have to find that there were heat of passion, mitigating circumstances. That's the only way you could get down to voluntary manslaughter. Okay. Now, you don't have to think that that's what the jury's going to do, but you had to do that analysis. The last is, can the jury properly find Dan guilty, not guilty by reason of insanity? So we need to talk about insanity. Here are the 4 versions of insanity that the bar examiners want you to know about. Let me talk about them one by one, and then we'll be done. To do that, I'm going to erase this part of the board. McNaughton rule. The McNaughton rule for insanity says that a person is insane if, because of a mental disease or defect, once again, a person is insane if, because of a mental disease or defect, there are 2 things. Number 1, the person either does not know what they're doing, or they did not know it was wrong. Doesn't know what they're doing, didn't know it was wrong. Using the McNaughton test, is Dan a person who, because of a mental disease or defect, we know he's got mental problems, is he a person who, because of mental disease or defect, did not know what he was doing when he hit Vic, or did not know it was wrong? Well, what evidence do we have? The evidence is against Dan. It's against Dan because the facts say that Dan knew he was hitting Vic but couldn't stop. The facts said he took the stand and he said that he was provoked to violence by Vic's crude remarks and could not stop himself from striking Vic. So he knew he was doing it. So we can't say he didn't know what he was doing, and there's no evidence that he didn't know that was wrong, none at all. And so the McNaughton test, and the McNaughton test, this would, Vic was not, Dan is not insane under the McNaughton test. Next, let's look at the irresistible impulse test. This might be a better test for them, don't you agree? So here is the irresistible impulse. Irresistible impulse says the person is crazy if they are unable to control their conduct. Now, here, that's the argument Dan is making. I could not stop myself, unable to control my conduct. And so this may be. And what evidence do you have? You get maximum points if you drag in all the evidence you can find that maybe this guy was unable to control his conduct. What evidence do you have? Well, first of all, he testified. So look at the evidence here. So first of all, he testified and said, I could not control my conduct. So that's part of it. Secondly, you had a psychiatrist. Now, we don't know exactly what the psychiatrist said, but the psychiatrist at least said the person had erratic behavior and been in and out of, he's been in and out of mental institutions all of his life. And he had other witnesses who testified about his erratic behavior. And so you have people saying this guy has been behaving erratically. We don't know exactly the nature of the erratic behavior, but he behaves erratically. We've got the psychiatrist. He's been in and out of institutions, and he testifies himself, I couldn't control it. Now, he has to prove, in most jurisdictions, he has to prove his insanity with the preponderance of the evidence. There are two ways this insanity is handled. In the bar exams, when you're talking about both. One way is that the state has to prove that the person is sane beyond a reasonable doubt. So the only thing a person has to do is to say, I'm insane. Well, they got to offer, some credible evidence. I'm insane, and they offer some credible evidence, and suddenly the prosecution's got to prove that the person is sane beyond a reasonable doubt. In other jurisdictions, it works the other way around. Insanity is considered an affirmative defense. And affirmative defense means that the defendant puts on that affirmative defense. And so Dan would put on the defense saying, I'm insane. And in that case, Dan has to prove I'm insane with the preponderance of the evidence. And so here's the evidence. If you're in that kind of jurisdiction, here's the evidence that Dan's got. And the jury could find that that's a preponderance of the evidence, and so Dan could be insane under the irresistible impulse. Next, model penal code. And by the way, if you look at this the other way around, where if Dan says I'm insane and the state has to prove that he is sane, with beyond a reasonable doubt, then the state would look to his conduct, says he's been in and out of institutions, true enough, but we don't have any evidence that, whatever standard you're using, so this guy, been working. He's working in the grocery store, making a living. The nature of his illness doesn't show he doesn't know what he's doing, and so forth. So the prosecution would just make whatever the rule is in that jurisdiction, the prosecution would have to prove that that didn't happen. Next comes the model penal code, and in the model penal code jurisdictions, insanity has two parts. The two parts are, number one, that because of mental disease or defect, like before, the person lacks substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct or to control their conduct. Let me repeat that again. Under the McNaughton rule, the person had to not know what they were doing. Under the model penal code, the person lacks substantial capacity to appreciate what they're doing. Much softer. You don't have to not know it. Just have reduced capacity to understand what you're doing. So under the model penal code, the person lacks substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct or to control it. Now, here we don't have any evidence that Dan was unable to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct, that you can't go around hitting people. But Dan says I was unable to control, and so under the model penal code, all he has to do is to show that I lacked substantial capacity to appreciate the, I lacked substantial capacity to control my conduct. Okay, under irresistible impulse, he's unable to control. Here, lacks substantial capacity to control. So under the model penal code, he just needs to lack substantial capacity to control conduct. And he might be able to prove that. But that's the standard. Whereas here, he had to be unable. The green, he was unable to control his conduct. So this one unable, this one lacks substantial capacity. So Dan might be insane under the model penal code. And finally, the Durham test simply says that the person's conduct was the product of a disease or a mental defect. And we don't know whether this particular conduct of his, getting mad and flying off like that, is that really part of his mental disease or defect? We don't know. There's only one state that may still be using Durham anyway. It's not a very useful test because it doesn't give you much to work with. So to summarize, we have 4 calls and we've answered all 4 of them. Can the jury properly find Dan guilty of first-degree murder? Answer, no, because they cannot establish the malice, in my opinion. Secondly, can the jury find Dan guilty, and also, they can't, Dan's not guilty of first-degree murder because we cannot establish the malice, and you cannot establish the aggravating factor such that even if you could find common law murder, you couldn't elevate it to first degree. So for both of those reasons, no first-degree murder, no malice, no aggravating circumstance. Secondly, can the jury find Dan guilty of second-degree murder? And the answer is, I don't think so, because you can't find the malice. Third, can the jury find Dan guilty of voluntary manslaughter? Well, again, if you don't find the malice, the answer is going to be no again. But in order to answer the bar question, you would say, you know, supposing that they could find the malice, if they could find the malice, then what would have been common law murder be mitigated down to voluntary manslaughter? And the theory for the mitigation is heat of passion. You go through the analysis, I don't think it works. Finally, can the jury properly find Dan guilty, not guilty by reason of insanity? And the answer is, depends on which insanity test you use. Under the McNaughton test, Dan is not insane under McNaughton. Under the irresistible impulse, maybe. I mean, is he really unable to control his conduct? Well, he's got some evidence. But if you go to the model penal code, where all you need is substantial capacity, lacks substantial capacity to control, we got a better shot at it. So he may be found not guilty by reason of insanity in this kind of a jurisdiction. And that is the end of this analysis.